Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Marcin Lawel. I represent the investor relations team of Tauron Polska Energia, and I have the pleasure to invite you to the meeting, to welcome you at the meeting for investors and analysts on Tauron Group's earnings for H1 2017. The highlights of the latest months will be commented and presented by the management board, represented by the CEO, Mr. Filip Grzegorczyk, and Mr. Marek Wadowski, the CFO. And we also have Mr. Dariusz Niemiec, the Managing Director for Trade, and Ronald Makieła, the Controlling Managing Director. Let me remind you that, as usual, the presentation will be conducted in Polish and simultaneously interpreted into English. Apart from the webcast, you can also listen to today's meeting by way of conference call. Please, Mr. President. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to welcome you very cordially. We have a pleasure to present to you today the earnings for the first half of 2017. The earnings, I must say, right at the beginning, are way better of last year's results in all aspects. These results, these earnings, but needs to be also emphasized, are in line with the expectations of the analysts. Let's move on to the financial results and the operating results for the first half of this year. We should start with EBITDA, namely the reported EBITDA for the first half of 2017 reached 2.1 billion PLN, which is 26% up versus last year. In terms of net profit, it topped 1 billion PLN, while in the first half of last year, we reported only 5 million PLN of net profit. Here, one needs to recall that last year's net profit was, of course, the consequence of very big write-downs due to the impairment charges related to the generation assets. In the first half of this year, we spent 1.5 billion PLN on CAPEX, which is a comparable amount to the amount spent last year. The key net debt to EBITDA ratio, as compared to the end of 2016, went down from 2.32 down to 2.17. The main factor behind this reduction of the leverage ratio was the high EBITDA generated by Tauron with a relatively small increase of debt. The details on the earnings and the debt, the financing issues will be outlined by the CFO, Mr. Wadowski, later on in the presentation. Moving on to the operating data, one must say that in the mining segment, but we start with traditionally, we reported a 34% increase of production. This is the result of higher volumes generated by all coal mines that our group owns, Tauron Group owns. In the generation segment, we had a 12% increase of electricity production volume and a 10% increase of heat production volume. In terms of electricity generation, this increase was due to the adopted trading strategy for 2017 and the higher demand for electricity, while the increase of heat production is a consequence of weather conditions, a relatively long and cold winter this year. Ladies and gentlemen, in the first half of this year, we reported a high 4% growth rate in our distribution segment, increase of distribution volume, electricity distribution volume, which we see as a consequence of good economic conditions. As you know very well, the distribution segment is responsible for generating 70% of the total EBITDA of our group. Therefore, this increase of volume that I just mentioned have a direct impact upon the earnings and the financial stability of Tauron Group. What else we would like to emphasize is the fact that, again, we can boast a strong restoration of electricity sales volume. The retail supply went up by 10% versus last year, which makes us very happy when this objective we are accomplishing in line with our plans. In terms of Q2 alone, earnings similar to the first half of this year, almost all key financial and operating data are better, are higher than last year. And let's start with EBITDA in Q2, 909 million PLN was 15% higher year on year. Net profit in Q2 was 365 million PLN. In the second quarter of last year, we reported a loss due to inclusion of big write-downs related to the impairment charges. In Q2, we also reported a 43% increase of the coal production, hard coal production. The electricity generation was 10% higher in Q2. The electricity distribution volume went up by 3%. In terms of electricity retail supply, we reported a 12% increase. So we are dealing with a similar trend, upward trend, as in the full first half of this year. Let's move on to the highlights. A significant number of these highlights was already discussed during the Q1 earnings conference. Let me draw attention to the most important events that took place over the last 3 months. And in June, we signed an agreement with the Polish Development Fund. It's an agreement that defines the preliminary terms of participation of the Polish Development Fund in the 910 megawatt power generation units construction project at Jaworzno 3 power plant. Polish Development Fund expressed interest in investing 880 million PLN in this project, which, if successful or when successful, will have a positive, when completed, will have a positive impact upon the balance sheet of Tauron Group. Currently are working on preparing and conducting the due diligence process and preparing the documentation, the project documentation, which will enable us to conclude the firm agreement with the Polish Development Fund. A very important event that we have the pleasure to report to you is the fact that at the beginning of July, Tauron successfully placed a public issue of Euro bonds worth 500 million euro with a 10-year maturity. The Eurobond issue of Tauron attracted a very strong interest on the market among both European and domestic investors, which is demonstrated by an almost threefold oversubscription of our issue. These bonds, it's worth mentioning or underlining, are listed on the London Stock Exchange. Here it should be clearly stated and emphasized that we are the first Polish company that has its debt instruments, notes, listed on the London Stock Exchange, which makes us very happy. The details of this transaction will be presented to the CFO, Mr. Wadowski, but I'd like to hand over the floor to now. Please, go ahead. Thank you very much. In the first half of this year, we were dealing with a favorable macroeconomic environment, solid GDP growth, increased manufacturing output sold, increase of electricity consumption, 2.3% domestic consumption, which had a major positive impact on our earnings. Apart from the good weather conditions for us, it just happens, namely a longer and colder than in previous years winter. In terms of electricity generation structure, we can see clear increase of output from renewable energy sources. We are assuming that this growth will continue. Therefore, it will have a growing impact upon our conventional generation, because we know that if there's no wind or there's no sun shining, then the conventional production should go up. Therefore, the production from the conventional units is higher than, so we have to display greater flexibility in this respect. Key financial data for first half year: net profit more than 1 billion PLN. EBITDA, if we compared comparable EBITDA, one of dissolving of a Stalowola CHP provision and the reduction of a provision, adjustment of a provision by the one-off bonus related to the agreement reached with the workforce in the amount of 55 million PLN, we would be dealing with an EBITDA increase of 17% versus last year in comparable terms. A few words about this agreement with the workforce. In Q2 this year, we signed an agreement with the workforce that makes the payout of a one-off bonus in each of the 3 years of the agreement's term, namely 2017, 2018, 2019, it makes it dependent upon the implementation of the efficiency improvement program. The bonus in 2017 is 55 million PLN. We are assuming that the same amount will be paid out in 2018 and 2019. However, in the agreement, there is a provision, there is a condition that if the effects of the efficiency improvement program will be higher, it's possible for this bonus to be higher. However, it's difficult as of today for us to estimate the scale of that, the magnitude of that increase, because it will be dependent upon the effects of the efficiency improvement program. Therefore, we are assuming that these costs, this one-off cost in the given year, will be recurring in the subsequent 2 years. In case of Q2, the comparable EBITDA, also having taken out the dissolving of CHP Stella Wola provision and the adjustment due to the one-off bonus, it shows the increase of 22%, which is a very positive trend, in our opinion, that we would like to continue, and we will tell you about the reasons for this trend in a moment. The key segments, mining, generation, distribution, and supply. In terms of key segments results, the situation has not changed. Our largest segment is the distribution. It's also worth mentioning the mining segment, which has improved its earnings versus the same period of last year. In terms of Q2, all our segments generated a positive EBITDA, including the mining segment, which had a very good Q2. As the CEO mentioned before, the increase of coal extraction was reported by all our coal mines. Therefore, the efficiency of the coal production was much higher. Looking at the growth contributing factors from split into per segment, we can see that the supply segment being the leader here, 256 million PLN. But let us remember that part of this 256 million PLN includes the dissolving of a 203 million PLN provision. So if we deducted this provision from this supply segment's earnings increase, so then the main driver of the EBITDA growth, H1 2017 versus H1 2016, comes from the mining segment, as a matter of fact. A similar situation applies if we look at Q2 alone, EBITDA going up 15%. Here, the impact of the dissolving of the provision related to the Stella Wola combined heat and power plant, 13 million PLN only, and we can see that the mining segment has the biggest contributor to the increase of EBITDA. Moving on to the mining segment itself, the main reason, as we can see in this slide, for the increase of EBITDA is the increased coal sales, and here we are showing 264 million PLN. This is the amount. It's worth underlining that what we are showing here is the net effect of an increase of the quantity of hard coal sold and the increase of price, whereas the price contribute only 17 million PLN to the increase of EBITDA. So one may say that the majority of this improved EBITDA in this segment is due to the increase of volume. The increase of volume of coal sold in the first half of this year also include the increase of production as well, because the increase of production led to the reduction of mining cash cost by 24.5%. Therefore, in the first half of 2017, the mining cash cost was 170 PLN, per ton, whereas 225 PLN in the same period of last year. As a result, the mining segment ended the first half of this year with a small minus at the EBITDA level, but it's a very small minus comparing to the situation last year. In Q2, the mining segment generated a positive EBITDA. In this quarter, the mining cash cost was 150 PLN per ton, 151 actually, versus 222 PLN per ton in the Q2 2016. This improvement of the unit cost of extraction was possible thanks to the cost control, cost discipline, and increased volume of coal extracted. In the case of a price, the price had an impact of 13 million PLN on positive impact upon the EBITDA increase, the rest of the increase coming from the increased volume. In the generation segment, in the first half of this year, we are dealing with a slight decline of EBITDA. The main reason for this decline was the declining margin on electricity. The main reason for the declining margin was, first of all, the price. The price was offset to a certain degree by the increase of electricity volume generated. However, it was not sufficient to fully offset the price impact, the price reduction impact. Additionally, the negative impact came from the declining prices of property rights, the prices of green certificates, which meant that this segment ended the first half of this year with lower earnings than last year. Q2 alone shows another impact on the generation's impact, namely the CO2 costs. In the first quarter, we're dealing with the transferring 1.7 million tons of free CO2 emission allowances from 2016 to 2017, and we have fully consumed this pool in the first quarter of this carbon credits. In the Q2, we didn't have those free carbon credits. Therefore, we are showing higher CO2 costs. This is due to two factors. The first important factor is, of course, a definitely smaller number of CO2 emission allowances for free versus Q2 last year. The second factor is the higher emission of CO2 due to the higher generation output. In the distribution segment, the main factor that impacted the improvement of EBITDA year on year was the increase of the volume of electricity distributed. We are observing a systematic increase of the volume of electricity distributed, especially in the SME segment, market segment. Here we are clearly seeing this segment quarter after quarter is showing growth. We are, of course, very happy about it. It's a positive effect of rising GDP, positive effect of growth of small and medium enterprises on the territory of our operations. It's also worth mentioning that we are observing growth in all tower groups, but to a smaller degree than in the SMEs segment. In Q2 alone, EBITDA is a bit lower in the distribution segment than in Q2 2016. Here, the factor that was the reason for this earning result that would have been better, the factor that reduced this result is the setting up of a provision related to the wages agreement with the workforce. It's not a big impact because the amount is 23 million PLN. However, had it not been for this impact, then this EBITDA result in Q2 alone would also have been higher. In the distribution segment, it's also worth mentioning two factors that I've been showing you for some time now, namely SAIDI and SAIFI. We are assuming that in 2017, we will comply with the requirements in terms of SAIDI and SAIFI levels, factors levels. Following the latest storms, we do not see weather storms. We don't see this having a major impact upon the SAIDI and SAIFI value on our territory. These storms in our territory of operations were definitely weaker than in other utility groups' distribution areas. Definitely, the April snow had a greater impact upon our earnings, on our situation. But 2017 we see as not being in danger of not complying with these factors. Of course, with an assumption that there will be no major weather crises will not happen, but in the subsequent years, the compliance with these factors, with these coefficients, will be a challenge for us. In the supply segment, in the first half of this year, the biggest impact came from the dissolving of Stalowa Wola combined heat and power plant provision. Apart from that, property rights, thanks to the lower property rights prices than last year in the same period, we had higher EBITDA for that reason. In combination with a decrease of property rights and the increase of the obligation, the net effect is positive. It's worth mentioning the electricity volume sold in the retail segment. This increase is substantial, whereas the overall effect of the volume and price is only slightly positive, because in this segment we are also dealing with a price decrease. The price decrease was offset by the increased volume, therefore we are getting a slight positive impact. Therefore, if we hadn't had this increase of electricity supply volume, then the impact of the price reduction would have been negative. In Q2 alone, in the supply segment, the situation is similar. However, here there's dissolving of the Stalowa Wola CHP. The provision is not so big. The main impact came from property rights and the slight net positive impact of the increased volume of electricity sold versus the declining prices. In terms of financial debt, at the end of June 2017, our net debt is slightly more than 9 billion PLN. The amount of financing available to Tauron is 3,600 million. Here, two important pieces of information. The first important piece of information is on the upper chart figure. We are showing the maturity of our debt. So you can see that 2019, 2020, you can see in these 2 years we have the biggest amounts to pay back, to repay. However, this is the maturity of the current debt. In June, we signed with the financing banks that are providing financing as part of a large 6.2 billion PLN, an agreement we signed based upon which we are extending the maturity of some bonds until 2021, 2022. This is not shown on this figure. This is the maturity of existing debt. We did not change the maturity of the debt, but we had this option. We have this option that some of this debt can be shifted to 2021 and some to 2022. Therefore, the spread over time here of the maturity will be a bit smoother here. And the second important piece of information is the next slide, please, is the issue of Eurobonds. It took place after the reporting period, namely on July 5th specifically, the 500 million euro amount. So if we added the 3 billion of 0.6 billion of financing available and the issue of Eurobond, so the total amount of financing available for Tauron Group is 5,700 million PLN. This is a sufficient amount to complete the CAPEX program, especially the construction of the Jaworzno 3 power generation unit. This is the amount that satisfies our needs for the near future. We are not expecting larger issues of debt in the coming time, in the near term. Although smaller issues, more for ongoing needs, but this will be definitely smaller amounts, they may happen. In terms of the Eurobond issue, here it's worth underlining the first thing, the use of proceeds from the issue. The goal here is to refinance the purchase of wind farms that Tauron Group has and covering the CAPEX in the distribution segment. We also have a provision on the general corporate purposes. However, the Eurobond money cannot be used to finance the coal project. This is applicable only to this amount, 500 million euro. That's not applicable to the entire financing that we have. Therefore, this money cannot be used, for instance, for completing the Jaworzno 3 construction project. But of course, the Jaworzno 3 project will be completed using other funds. And the second important caveat that's worth mentioning is the truth is that the interest was very strong in this issue. The first thing that we are afraid most of was the maturity, because 10 years. If you look at the market debut, it's quite a long term, but selling our strategy, because as a matter of fact, we were selling to our investors, we're showing how we want to operate on the market. Selling our strategy, we have faced very strong interest, almost 3 times higher interest than what we were offering, which enabled us here to achieve satisfactory pricing parameters for our Eurobond issue. And in terms of capex, let me hand over to the CEO again, the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, well, it will not be a surprise when I say that our most important investment project continues to be the construction of a hard coal-fired power generation unit at Jaworzno 3 power plant. At the end of the first half of this year, the work progress was 39% at this construction site. We continue to affirm the planned completion date being November 2019. Another important project is the CCGT unit at Stalowa Wola. There we have 86% work progress. For now, the investment project was inventoried. This project will be continued along with a partner, namely the PGNiG, Polish Oil and Gas Company, and the planned completion date also 2019. In the mining line of business, we are conducting 3 relatively large investment projects. First of all, the construction of an 800-meter level at Janina coal mine, construction of Grzegorz shaft at Sobieski coal mine, and capex program at Brzeszcze coal mine. In terms of capex in the first half of this year, we spent 1.5 billion PLN, where basically they should be assigned to 2 main segments. Distribution, 605 million PLN, used to refurbish, upgrade the grid assets and new connections, new customer connection, and 814 million in the generation segment, and the entire capex here was spent on the Jaworzno project. Ladies and gentlemen, what we would like to draw attention to is the improvement efficiency program. It is being carried out as part of adopted strategy, the 3rd efficiency improvement program that we are implementing. The program assumes that in 2016-2018 time frame, the total savings will be 1.3 billion PLN. From the beginning of 2016, we have the effects already realized was 750 million PLN, which is 58%, represents 58% of the total value, total amount of the efficiency improvement program. And the biggest savings was generated in the distribution and generation segments. Next to efficiency improvement program, we are also implementing the so-called strategic initiatives. These activities are also carried out as part of our strategy. These are various optimization and pro-efficiency measures planned for the 2017-2020 time frame. They include, for instance, reducing capex, optimizing assets utilization, or developing new products. As part of strategic initiatives, we are assuming generating total effects in the 2017-2020 time frame of 3.4 billion PLN. In the first half of this year, the realized savings effects reached 480 million PLN, which represents 14% of the planned aggregate amount of this project. It seems, ladies and gentlemen, that this is where we'd like to finish the presentation of the earnings and the highlights of Tauron Group in the first half of this year. And traditionally, we'd like to invite you to ask questions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the management board for the presentation. We'd like to invite you to ask questions. The persons following our presentation remotely, please send questions using the email, the form that's available on the webcast site, please. Please, Mr. Kubiszewski. this 2.17 net debt to EBITDA, I understand, does not take into account the bonds. They will never be taken into account, as a matter of fact, yes? In this leverage ratio that you are displaying. You're asking about Euro bonds, yes? This is the June 30th, and Euro bonds were issued on July 9th. The question is whether they will be included from the covenant point of view. They will not be, yes? No, they will be. They will be included in calculations for the covenant. When we issue Eurobonds for slightly more than 2 billion PLN, then we don't have such needs. It is as follows. If we issue Eurobonds worth 2 billion, at the same time cash goes up. So the net debt does not change unless we spend this cash for CapEx. These Eurobonds will be included in the leverage ratio. The only Eurobonds that are not included are the subordinate hybrid Eurobonds issued in December 2016. This is 190 million PLN. They are not included in the leverage calculation. They are not included in this leverage calculation, leverage ratio calculation. I understand that in 2019, 2 billion to be repaid, 2020, 3 billion to be repaid. Now, 2 billion you acquired, so it will be rolled over. The 3 billion is still there to be repaid. So how will this be managed? Yes. First of all, we are spreading it over time. So to repay in according to the plan for today, this is the tenor, the maturity of repayment. But we have this option to roll over these bonds to 2021 and 2022, and for 2020, according to our expectations, this is the amount to be repaid, would be 757 million PLN to be repaid. This is the situation of today. These are not amounts that would be impossible not to repay. Let me remind you of one thing, namely that we assume in our projection starting from 2020, the Jaworzno-free power generation unit will be in operation. There will be two effects of this operation. First of all, we will not be sending any more money for CapEx, which will definitely reduce our CapEx. Secondly, we will be generating revenue from sales, electricity sales generated by this unit. However, what will follow, what will happen next, is difficult for us to say as of today, because that's true. In 2021, 2022, we'll have to face either the repayment or rollover of the bonds to be repaid. However, a lot will depend upon what will be happening on the market, the capacity market, and so on. It's difficult to say anything more definite about it as of today. You said the following thing, that the cost of the bonuses for the workforce will be recurring in the subsequent years, depending upon how effective is the savings program. Can we find out what's the details about that? As of today, we are assuming this will be in the same amount as in 2017, namely 55 in the first year, 55 million in the second year, 55 million in the third year. This is the assumption for today. But however, if it turned out that the implementation of the efficiency improvement program is better than what we stated in this program, so then the bonus amount may go up. The question is by how much? I think that it can be maximum 20% tops higher, but it depends upon the implementation of this program. If the program is implemented in line with its provisions, then this will be the amount that we were dealing with in 2017. What was the effect, the result of the effect of transferring carbon credits, CO2 emission allowances between years 2016 and 2017? What was the effect generated from this transition, from this transfer? Just a moment, please. We have it somewhere. However, we have to find it, the figure that you're asking for. $15 million. The transfer to Q1, it seems to me that it was 15 million. Yes. 15 million. So maybe some other questions. Is my understanding correct? Moving on to the capacity market, is my understanding correct that the capacity market will have an impact upon the transfer of EBITDA from the generation between subsidiaries, bypassing the value of the program? Isn't it so that the capacity market will take some from PGE, some money from PGE to Tauron as a rule? That's how it is designed. Let me give you an introduction. Maybe Darek will supplement the statement. The assumption of a capacity market definitely is not a zero-sum game, but you take away from one and give to the other. Our assumption is that total pool of funds to be distributed will be about 4 billion PLN per annum. As of today, RM operational capacity reserve is 500 million PLN. Operational capacity reserve. So if you compare to the operational capacity reserve mechanism, the amount is much higher. Of course, the distribution among the utilities is to be decided, but everyone, all players, all market players should have higher revenue from this. If that I could maybe add to that. Let me answer what you said, certain reallocation of margins. So if we take into account, for instance, American markets that went from the single commodity to dual commodity markets, so the single commodity after capacity market, the non-profit, is based on variable costs, whereas the competition takes place on fixed costs, then that's true. The experience from that market indicates that the reallocation margin goes from the units that are heavily used in the system towards the units that were less intensely used in the system. Whereas on the European continent, if so, we'll be dealing with a certain addition to the single product market. Namely, in Poland, if the capacity market comes into place, it will not be an electricity market, non-profit electricity market based only solely on variable costs. It will be an addition to this market in order to meet certain objectives in terms of refurbishments and the missing money problem, which is affecting the entire continent practically. Operational capital reserve will not stay. So what's the impact of the operational capital reserve? I think the OCM, operational capital reserve mechanism, will be maintained, will be continued. Of course, its structure, its budget will be different, in different scale, because the TSO has to buy reserves before they ahead. I think the operational capital reserve will be in some shape, but operational capital reserve today has a major impact upon prices. It's a certain lever here today, pricing lever, based, let me remind you, the budget is calculated as not full fixed costs, excluding management costs, and a number of cost items are not included. To classify the budget, Polish operational capital reserve mechanism's budget, but definitely it has an impact upon wholesale prices, it's kind of a lever on the wholesale prices. Thank you. And when's the first auction planned under the capacity market? What's your expectation? Well, we are sticking to the provisions that are being debated by the parliament, because the lawyers in the parliament according to these provisions, if they are not amended, so far we haven't heard of such amendments. The first auction will be free auctions, as a matter of fact, for the subsequent years, 2021, 2022, 2023. Three separate auctions will be the last quarter of 2018. Let me repeat that this is provided the provisions are not amended by the parliament. We have a question from Mr. Tomasz Stępień from Argus Media. What are your forecasts for coal prices and electricity prices for 2018? In terms of electricity prices for 2018, we are not expecting major changes versus what we are dealing with today. We can see clearly that in terms of prices, they continue at a similar level. It's difficult to imagine that there will be some factor on the market which would mean that those prices would be substantially changed. In terms of hard coal prices, we are expecting rising coal prices. Let me put it this way. PGG, Polish Mining Group, in its price list is offering today coal at the price of 12 PLN per gigajoule. This price will not be as high, maybe. Nevertheless, there will be a substantial increase versus the price of 2017. Thank you very much. Anyone else who would like to ask a question? Yes, please. Good afternoon, Robert Ipopema. Question about the mining segment in Q3, Q4. Is there any problem with the production? The press release mentioned that you might be behind schedule, behind plan. That's one thing. Secondly, the wind farms that you want to buy from the proceeds from the bonds, are these the wind farms that you once were trying to sell, or will you'll be getting them back or something? And maybe that's it for now, please. Well, in terms of mining, the first half of this year was very good. And here one may say that Tauron mining line of business subsidiary must be praised strongly that they put a lot of effort into making this production higher. And nevertheless, from the beginning, from the second half of this year, we can see the situation is much more difficult. As of today, we are in the second half of August. The situation continues to be difficult. We must remember that mining is always dependent upon the geological and mining conditions and events that are hard to predict. Here we are dealing with such a situation that certain things might not be fully, for us, positive as we originally assumed. Nevertheless, we're doing our best to improve this extraction. We are assuming that over the whole year in the mining segment, we may have, versus the budget, we may have an adjustment, downward adjustment, but it shouldn't be a significant adjustment. We continue to maintain that the EBITDA of the segment for the full year will be positive. Nevertheless, it will be a big challenge looking at how this extraction is shaping. We can see clearly that the mining segment can be profitable. However, we still face a lot of effort to restore the situation to the good condition that we were dealing with in Q2, especially. When this restoration will take place, I can see it more in the next year, probably. Hopefully Q4. We'll see. We'll see how this all works out. However, we are taking all actions, all efforts, making all efforts to improve the situation. And wind farms? Wind farms, I understand you're asking about the disputes. There are two questions. One, during the presentation, you mentioned that the issue was proceeds were used to repurchase the wind farms. And the second thing is the litigations, the court disputes. What's the status and what can we expect from this? And to extend this question, I understand the law that was passed, that was signed, doesn't help you much because you already terminated the contract. So active long-term contracts that could be automatically repriced. You don't have too many of them in your portfolio. Can you confirm? Let me start with the last one. We don't have at all in our portfolio any contracts because all of them we terminated. Of course, there are certain reports in the media circulating that are reflected in the correspondence that we are conducting, the correspondence we are getting from the wind farms. Actually, but the wind farms are demanding from us compensation. But the legal situation is as such that the contracts that we had with wind farms were terminated. Our position is that they were effectively terminated. Therefore, the positive effects of the law we are not recognizing, because in our opinion, those agreements are no longer in place anymore. However, I don't know if I would like to add something. However, let me just add that that's true. According to the information that we were providing on the market, but the situation before was such that the subsidiary of Tauron was in dispute, namely Polska Energia Kompania Handlowa, and this subsidiary terminated the agreements with the wind farms. Today we are dealing with the lawsuit directed against Tauron itself, Tauron as such, Tauron parent company, and this is the dispute of compensation nature, for compensation, but we do not identify, we don't see a greater chance, much chances for our opponents in this dispute, which is based on the basic legal principles in force in Poland, because there's a lawsuit that is trying to transfer onto us the responsibility of the actions of a separate legal entity, namely Pierwsza Kompania Handlowa. So this lawsuit was submitted. Of course, we are preparing ourselves for the trial. We are preparing our response to the lawsuit, but the probability, we'll see, but the probability of Tauron losing this dispute is very small, negligent, I would say. Not too, it's simply negligent, yes. So this is the dispute whether one would be able to get through the corporate shell, namely the legal personality of another company. We are of the opinion this is not admissible according to the Polish law. We see this lawsuit more as exerting some pressure on our company, not a real threat. In terms of Eurobond issue, one of the goals was to refinance the spending on wind farms purchases, but this the refinancing of the wind farms that we have in our portfolio as of today. Why we did we do that? This is due to the fact that we want to reduce the debts of these wind farms. They have quite big debts. We took write-downs on the carrying amount on the balance sheet in these companies. Therefore, the company that holds this in its portfolio of these wind farms is in a difficult financial position due to the big write-downs and low certificate prices, and we want to refinance these spending to have this company grow and to restore financial health to this position. Thank you very much. Any more questions? One more question, Martin Stoko from the brokerage house. Please remind us what were the causes of your extraction problems. What was the true reason for those? The mining problems, what was the problem? Because we wasn't really. We are dealing, for instance, with, professionally they call it, for instance, one coal face getting tighter in Tianina coal mine. Therefore, namely, the geological mining conditions on this coal face turn out to be much more difficult. We face some unexpected obstacles. These are the events more of that are difficult to foresee. Of course, there were some failures as well, but failures always occur. Especially the biggest impact came from the unexpected geological and mining developments. Okay, thank you very much. Well, two questions related to the wind farms. Isn't it so that this entity is trying to transfer this dispute to the European justice outside of the Polish law? Second question is, if you theoretically calculated the value of those claims, it took a few years, so how much money would it be if all wind farms came to you with the same lawsuit? I'm not talking about the future, but as of now, what's the difference on prices times volume? Let me answer the first question. It's difficult to say whether they are trying or not trying to transfer to the European justice area, because it's the strategy of our opponent. But today we have to stick to the rules that are in place in Poland. Additionally, in the majority of EU countries, also there's a principle of limited liability of the shareholder in the given entity. So if we have shareholders, financial investors, it's difficult for us to agree to transfer to Tauron the business risk of other entities. And we will not be doing that. But I don't want to speak about our opponent's strategy. We evaluate it as totally unjustified. You're talking about the total amount of these disputes, but I don't know if this is a good thing to try to give an answer on this question, because if we talk about the disputes that are between PKH and the wind farms, in terms of contract termination, one of those disputes, that was resolved, the only one that was resolved in favor of Tauron. Therefore, the sequence of events is such, as a rule, that first of all, you have to have a ruling about whether Tauron's subsidiary legally or legally terminated the contracts, the agreements. We are saying it was done legally. Only after that, subsequently, you can transfer this dispute to the parent company. And I think that's all. This is better not to throw such numbers around, especially so that there's very little reasons to indicate that these numbers will really be used in practice. Let me add one thing. What was published in the media, namely the value of claim, 1,200 million of wind energy, is the amount that includes both the demand for compensation for the operations up to now and also forward. So there are certain assumptions made in terms of electricity prices, prices of green certificates. This is highly subjective, a matter of judgment, and you can throw any assumptions around here. So that's why they arrive at this high amount. But these are definitely not the amount of a compensation that our opponent is demanding, because the compensation is something that you can demand for something that happened, not for something may happen in the future. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for accepting the invitation to our meeting. Our speakers will be at your service for a few minutes after the meeting. Taking this opportunity, I'd like to invite you to the summary of Q3. This meeting will be held in November, and please stay in touch with our investor relations team. We'd like to invite you to contact us. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Thank you.